In the tranquil forest of Alder Creek, sunlight filtered through towering pines and cast gentle patterns on the mossy ground. A light breeze carried the scents of damp earth and pine resin, a scent that James had come to cherish over his years as a forest ranger. It was early morning, the best time of day in his mind, when everything was still waking up, birds calling softly and squirrels daring quick runs across fallen logs. James parked his battered green pickup on the narrow dirt track and stepped out, boots sinking slightly into last night's rain-soaked ground. He was scheduled to check a trail camera near a clearing where elk were known to graze. It was supposed to be a routine morning. He was halfway down the narrow game trail when a sound made him stop. It was faint, a tiny cheer-up that didn't belong to any songbird he recognized. James turned, listening intently. Another small cry, a bit like a kitten but sharper, more insistent. He followed the sound off the trail, pushing aside ferns and low branches until he reached a thicket at the base of an old cedar. There, in a little hollow scraped into the earth, lay two bobcat cubs. They were huddled so close together they almost looked like one creature there, spotted coats blending beautifully with the dappled light. When James knelt for a better look, they shrank back, tiny lips pulling into silent hisses, wide blue-gray eyes full of fear. "Hey, there," James murmured, lowering himself slowly. "Easy now. Where's your mama?" He looked around for any sign of an adult bobcat. Fresh tracks, broken twigs, a rustle in the brush. Nothing. The cubs couldn't be more than 6 weeks old. Their ears were still slightly rounded, their tails comically short, their bodies small enough to fit in two hands. One had a faint white spot above her right eye. The other had darker paws and slightly larger ears. They were alone, trembling, and it was clear they hadn't eaten properly for some time. Their little bellies were hollow, and when they opened their mouths again, frail mew came out that broke something in James. "All right, little ones," he sighed, carefully pulling off his uniform jacket. "I guess you're coming with me." It took some coaxing, but soon he had the two frightened cubs bundled in the warm fabric. They squirmed and protested, letting out little growly squeaks that sounded for all the world like complaints. As he made his way back to the truck, James couldn't help chuckling. "You two talk more than my old supervisor," he told them. "And that's saying something." When he settled them in the passenger seat, the cubs began their odd vocalizations again. Little yowls, chirps, and grumbles, punctuated by what could only be described as impatient sighs. The female with the white spot even raised a paw once and seemed to wave it at him. James laughed outright. "Giving me orders already, huh? Well, you'll have to wait till we get home." The drive back to his small cabin on the edge of Alder Creek Forest was punctuated by more of the cubs' nonstop chatter. They didn't sound distressed anymore, just noisy like two old ladies gossiping on a porch. At one point, the male planted both front paws on the dashboard and let out a bizarre warble that startled James so badly he nearly ran off the road. "Whoa there," James barked, then shook his head. "You trying to drive us off a cliff? Settle down, chatterbox." Once at his cabin, James set up a large dog crate in the living room with soft blankets and a low bowl of diluted goat milk. The cubs took one look at the setup and began a joint tirade of squeaks and odd little squeals, circling each other as though discussing how unacceptable his accommodations were. The female battered her brother lightly on the nose, then turned her bright eyes on James and let out a long trill. Her tiny pink tongue poking out at the end. All right. I hear you, James said, hands on hips. But that's the best. I've got unless you two plan on sleeping in my bed. For the first couple of days, it was a rocky start. The cubs seemed to complain about everything. When he offered them the milk, they sat together and mewled at him in alternating turns as if debating whether it was worth trying. Eventually, hunger won, and they both dove in, getting more on their faces and paws than in their mouths. That earned them a round of snuffling, smacking, and very loud conversations as they cleaned each other up. James sat on the floor nearby, just listening, marveling at the constant barrage of noises. They were like tiny comedians, one issuing a squeaky grumble, the other answering with a short bark that almost sounded offended. Then they'd both start over again, heads bobbing, tails flicking, bodies vibrating with opinion. By the end of the week, the cubs had taken over James's cabin as though they owned it. The male discovered he could climb onto the kitchen table and from there onto the countertop. The female figured out how to open the cabinet under the sink. Every new discovery was announced with a sharp yowl, then followed by an excited, rapid-fire chitter that sounded suspiciously like, "Look what I did." James tried to scold them, but ended up laughing too hard every time. Their funniest habit was how they'd follow him around, talking the entire time. If he went outside to chop wood, they sat by the screen door and meowed and chirped at him nonstop, heads tilting dramatically. When he came back inside, they raced up to him, each trying to outdo the other with bizarre vocal performances that were somewhere between a baby goat and a rusty hinge. One afternoon, after sweeping the porch, James plopped into his old rocking chair exhausted. The cubs immediately jumped into his lap. First the female, curling under his chin with a high-pitched mutter, then the male, flopping across his knees with a woof. Together they purred so loudly it rattled in his chest. And then they both started talking again, tiny throats working, eyes squinting in utter delight. James stroked their spotted heads and whispered, "I swear you two are telling me all the day's gossip. If only I spoke." Bobcat. As the days turned into weeks, their antics only grew funnier. They invented games together, racing from one end of the cabin to the other, leaping over furniture, tackling each other, all while making an incredible variety of sounds. Sometimes the female would chase her brother into a corner, trap him with a dramatic pounce, and let out a long speech of chirps and growls while he lay there, listening with his ears flattened, as if he was being lectured. Other times he'd sneak up on her, deliver a playful cuff to the shoulder, then zoom off, trailing what sounded like giggly squeaks. James often stood doubled over, laughing, tears in his eyes. "You two are the best entertainment I've ever had," he told them. He took videos with his phone, sending them to his sister, who lived back in the city. She started forwarding them to her friends, and soon James was getting messages from strangers saying, "That talking bobcat pair makes my whole week, and please post more of their funny arguments." It seemed everyone fell in love with these goofy chatterboxes. As they grew stronger, James began taking them on short, supervised walks just outside the cabin. The forest was their natural playground, and though still very young, their instincts were clear. They'd stalk butterflies, pounce on unsuspecting beetles, and try unsuccessfully to ambush each other behind logs. Through it all, they kept up their remarkable dialogue. The male especially developed a habit of turning to James every few minutes, issuing a long questioning mouth that almost demanded, "Did you see that? Wasn't I impressive?" The female usually responded with a sharp trill as if rolling her eyes at her brothers, bragging. One morning after a rain, James found them standing on the wet deck, peering out at a rabbit nibbling clover just beyond the yard. Both froze, tails twitching, bodies low. Then the male opened his mouth and let out a long, wobbling lecture that startled the rabbit into bolting. The female whipped around, smacked him with a paw, and let out a furious series of yowls that could only mean, "You ruined everything." James laughed so hard he nearly dropped the basket of kindling he was carrying. "Well, maybe next time you'll try being quiet first," he told them. The male bobcat blinked at him, let out a short huff that sounded suspiciously like, "Whatever," and sauntered back inside. Months passed. The cubs grew leaner, longer, their baby spots giving way to sleek adult markings. Their limbs stretched out, graceful and strong, paws no longer clumsy but deaf and silent as they moved through the cabin and the forest beyond. Yet, despite all the ways they changed on the outside, their playful, talkative nature never left them. Each morning they bounded up to James with bright eyes and twitching whiskers, greeting him with an excited cacophony of trills, cheer-ups, and those odd little warbles he had come to treasure. It was as if they needed to tell him every detail of the dreams they'd had overnight, each squeak and sigh, snippet of some whimsical tale that made James laugh before the sun was fully up. Sometimes the female pressed her forehead against his knee, issuing a series of low, throaty murmurs that sounded uncannily like complaints about how long he'd slept in. Her brother often interrupted her with short, sharp barks as though he couldn't wait his turn to add his own version of events. James would stand there with his morning coffee, letting the steam rise into the cool air, grinning down at his two demanding housemates who seemed to have discovered the joy of morning gossip. In the evenings, it became their ritual to gather by the fire. James settled into his old rocking chair, the wood creaking familiarly beneath him, while the two bobcats claimed their usual spots, one on either side. The female curled herself tightly against his hip, paws kneading the blanket draped over his legs as she mumbled little contented phrases that made her whiskers flutter. The male sprawled out closer to the hearth, one paw draped over James's boot, offering low purr punctuated by faint, questioning grunts that rose and fell like tiny secret confessions. Sometimes they pressed their foreheads together, eyes half closed, exchanging gentle trills that sounded like bedtime stories told in the language of bobcats. James often sat there long after the flames began to ebb into glowing coals, watching the light dance over their sleek spotted coats. One hand rested on each warm, living body, feeling the vibrations of their purr, tracing the subtle rise and fall of their breathing. His mind wandered back to the first day he found them, frail, terrified little scraps of life hidden in the forest, and he marveled at how completely they had transformed his days. It was supposed to be a temporary rescue, a way to keep them alive until someone better suited could take over. But looking into their bright, mischievous eyes now, listening to their endless conversations that filled his quiet cabin with color, he knew there would never be anyone better. They were family now, complete with goofy arguments, playful ambushes in the kitchen, and daily debates that only they understood. Each night as sleep began to pull him under. James drifted off to the sound of their gentle purr, mixed with faint mumbling like they were still whispering stories to each other long after he closed his eyes. And, as his heartbeat slowed, wrapped in the comfort of their closeness, James thought it was the happiest kind of music a man could ask for.